A soldier returned home in the middle of the night after a long deployment, only to be jolted by the sudden, blood-curdling scream of his daughter coming from inside the house. When he rushed into the room and saw what lay before him, he was paralyzed. A fine mist fell over the suburban houses. The dim yellow light from windows, fogged with condensation, flickered through the windshield, making James Whitmore squint as he turned into the narrow driveway leading to his home. It had been nearly 3 months since he last held his daughter. Nearly 3 months stationed at a special training camp on the West Coast. No letters, no photos, just one objective. Finish the assignment, come home. His rain-soaked backpack slapped against his back. Left hand gripping the strap, right hand reaching for the spare key still hidden under the porch light. The door opened without a sound. A wave of synthetic fragrance hit him, lavender and lemon. Scents he never used in the house. The ceiling glowed softly under a row of white LED lights. The couch had been reupholstered. A candle burned steadily on the dining table. "James?" Diane's voice called out from the kitchens, surprised, though not exactly unsettled. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out. "I didn't think you'd be back today." Dianath woman James met 2 years after his first wife died in a car crash. She was nearly 10 years his junior, once worked at a small coffee shop near the base. They'd married after 8 months, partly because Emily needed a woman in the house, and partly because James believed he was ready to start over. James gave a small nod. "Got early leave, thought I'd surprise you." Diane smiled, brief and soft. "Emily'll be thrilled." "Where is she?" James set his backpack down near the door, eyes scanning the room quickly. There was no sign of a child having played there that day. No tiny shoes, no familiar stuffed animal draped over the arm of the couch. Everything was too neat, too still. "She went to bed, played a lot today, wore herself out," Diane said, turning her back to him, her voice steady. James didn't respond. Instead, he walked slowly toward the stairs. He paused on the landing. Emily's room was dark. The door closed. No sound came from inside. Then suddenly, a scream tore through the air. "Daddy! Daddy!" Without missing a beat, James lunged forward. His hand grabbed the doorknob, but it was locked. He stepped back half a pace, braced himself, and kicked hard. The door flew open. Light from the hallway spilled into the room. Inside, Emily was curled up in the corner, her face streaked with tears. Her nightgown was wrinkled. A faint red mark stood out on her left cheek, like it had just been made. Diane was standing barely 2 steps from the child, still holding a small pillow as if she had just thrown it onto the bed. For a few seconds, all 3 of them stood frozen in silence. James stepped forward and dropped to his knees beside Emily. She recoiled slightly. When he reached out and touched her shoulder, she didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She just sat there, eyes staring blankly past him. She was messing around, running in the room, slipped and fell, then screamed. "I was just about to handle it," Diane said. Her voice was shaky, but trying hard not to be. James didn't look at her. He gently pulled Emily toward him, checking the back of her neck. An old bruise. Her little hands were ice cold. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around her, holding her close. "You told me she was asleep," James said, eyes still fixed on Emily. Diane's voice turned stiff. "She was asleep at the time." James picked Emily up. She didn't respond. Her arms hung limp, her head resting on his shoulder like she didn't have any strength left. A single tear slid silently down her cheek, soaking into James's collar. He didn't wipe it away. He turned. Ricky and Mrs. Susan were standing at the top of the stairs. Ricky asked, "What happened?" All I heard was a scream. James didn't answer. He walked steadily down the stairs, holding Emily in his arms. He passed Dianesh Move to block him, but didn't dare. In the living room, James grabbed the throw blanket off the couch and gently covered his daughter. He laid her down on the long sofa. Then he turned back, facing the 3 of them frozen in place. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and firm like a command from a military officer. No one said a word. James walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. There was no carton of special milk, the kind Emily had to drink because she couldn't handle regular dairy. None of the familiar foods she liked were there. He looked around the kitchen. The little plastic cup, shaped like an owl, his daughter's favorite, was nowhere to be found. He went back to the couch. Emily was still lying there, eyes open, silent. James sat down and leaned in close. "Talk to me. What happened?" He kept his voice soft. Emily pressed her lips together and shook her head. James closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the first thing he said wasn't a word of comfort. "From now on, no one goes into your room except me. You understand?" Emily gave a faint nod, then whispered, "Are you leaving again?" James didn't answer right away. That question, sharp and sudden, cut through his chest like a blade. "No," he said firmly this time. "I'm staying. I won't let anyone hurt you again." And in that moment, James had no way of knowing that the promise he had just made a father's final vow would become the beginning of a pain so cruel he couldn't have imagined it in his darkest thoughts. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room and stayed there all night, her head resting against James's arm. Every now and then she stirred slightly in her sleep, but didn't make a sound. James hadn't slept at all. He kept his hand on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on her tiny face, where the red mark on her cheek had faded to a lighter shade. When the sky began to lighten with dawn, he gently carried her upstairs, without saying a word to anyone. He turned on the bedroom light to its dimmest setting, tucked the blanket around her, then pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Sliding his hand under the edge of the blanket, he quietly checked her joints, elbows, calves, wrists, the base of her neck, each movement, careful not to wake her. Just below her left wrist was a bruise, greenish-purple, turning yellow around the edges, the shape indistinct but still there. Near the nape of her neck, close to her hairline, there was a faint round mark, like an old scratch or a fingernail press. James stopped breathing for a few seconds, slowly pulled his hand back, stood up, and walked quietly to the kitchen when he heard the first clink of dishes downstairs. Diane was already dressed, her hair pinned up in a neat bun, a spotless white apron tied around her waist. Ricky sat at the table in a grey hoodie, eating cereal with his feet propped up on the opposite chair. Mrs. Susan was pouring coffee. She glanced at James and gave a small smile, as if nothing at all had happened the night before. "Want some coffee?" Diane asked, still laying slices of bread onto a plate. James shook his head and leaned against the doorframe. "Is Emily still asleep?" Ricky asked casually, mouth half full. "She's tired," James said, his eyes locked on Diane's hands as she sliced the butter. "What's that bruise on her cheek?" Diane paused for a split second, then kept working like she hadn't heard him. "She probably fell yesterday. You know how she's always running around, I told you already." "And the mark under her wrist?" James asked again, this time his voice lower. Mrs. Susan sipped her coffee silently. "It's old. Maybe from school. I don't know." Diane turned to face him, her expression neutral, even giving a small shrug. "Or maybe from when the housekeeper was still here, before she quit." The next morning, James took Emily to preschool like he always did. He said very little during the drive. Emily sat quietly, staring out the window, clutching the small stuffed bear he'd bought her for her 4th birthday. The bear was worn now, but she held onto it tightly, as if it were the only thing left that still felt familiar. The preschool sat at the end of the street, a red brick building with moss creeping along the base of the outer wall. The backyard was still damp from the rain the night before. James led Emily up the front steps. Her hand never left the bear. Bethany, the teacher, stood in the doorway with the attendance clipboard in her hands. Her expression faltered for just a second when she saw James there. "Good morning, Emily," she said gently, crouching down to greet her. Emily didn't answer. She just gave a small nod, her eyes avoiding everyone else's. James placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, leaned down, and said to the little girl, "Go on in, sweetheart. I'm just going to have a quick word with Miss Bethany, and then I'll come get you." Emily gave a faint nod and quietly walked into the classroom. When the door closed behind her, James kept his eyes fixed on Bethany's face. "Miss," he began, his tone even, "while I was away, did you notice anything different about Emily? Any changes in her behavior or how she interacts with others?" Bethany looked a little uneasy and adjusted her glasses. "Well, she's been quieter than usual, tends to sit by herself, draws a lot but won't share what she's drawing, doesn't smile as much either. Less smiling, drawing alone. Do you think, is there anything that might be scaring her?" James asked, his gaze steady and unblinking. Bethany glanced toward the classroom through the window, then turned back. "I think something's not quite right, but I can't put my finger on it. She doesn't react much when the other kids tease her or bump into her. Lately, she startles easily at loud noises." "Have you ever seen bruises or anything unusual on her body?" James lowered his voice, sharper now, more focused. Bethany paused. "Yes, I saw a small scrape on her wrist once, and a reddish mark on the back of her neck. I asked about it, but Miss Diane said Emily's clumsy, always tripping over chairs and desks." "You believe that?" James cut in. For the first time since the conversation started, Bethany met his eyes. 1 second, then 2. She shook her head very slightly. "I don't know. I don't have the authority to interfere in family matters." James nodded slowly, expression unreadable. He pulled out his wallet, took a business card, flipped it over, and wrote a number in ink. "If anything else comes up, anything at all, please call me." He slipped the card into her hand, firm but gentle. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, striding down the steps, hands in his coat pockets, chin tucked down against the wind. That afternoon on the drive home, he stopped by a park and bought 2 ice cream cones. The cold air kept them from melting fast, but Emily didn't eat hers. She just stared at it. "Tired, honey?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "No," Emily said softly. James looked into her eyes, then asked, "Did your stepmother hurt you?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head, then nodded. James didn't press her. He just sat quietly. After a while, Emily looked down at her hands and said softly, "My stepmom doesn't like me, but Grandma said if I told you, you'd leave and never come back." James turned fully toward her, his gaze steady. "Who told you that?" "Grandma did, and my stepmom too." Emily looked up at him straight in the eyes for the first time that day. "I'm scared that if I tell the truth, you'll disappear." James let out a sigh. He set his uneaten ice cream down on the bench and reached out to pull her into a hug. Emily didn't hug him back, but she didn't pull away either. "Listen to me," he whispered close to her ear. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, I'm not going anywhere. Even if you're mad at me, even if you don't want to talk to me, I'll still be here." Emily gave a small nod, so small it felt like she was still holding back, even from her own hope. James decided to cancel his return to the unit. That morning, he sent an email requesting a 7-day leave of absence without giving a reason. He needed time at home, needed to see for himself what was going on. Not through instinct, through the truth. He didn't say much, just used the excuse of a headache, need to rest, then pretended to be worn out and went upstairs, lying in bed all through lunch. The door was left slightly ajar, the curtains drawn, but his ears weren't resting. He heard every footstep on the wooden floor, the soft roll of a suitcase down the hall, the clinking of spoons and forks from the kitchen below. Around 11:30, he heard Emily's soft slippers shuffle to a stop near the kitchen. Then Diane's voice, low, not loud, but clear enough for him to catch every word. "Dirtying up the floor again. Just how far are you trying to push me?" No reply. Just a few seconds of silence, dragging out. Then Diane again, sharper this time, almost snarling. "You're lucky you still get to eat, to have clothes, to live in this house. Your mother dying was the best thing that ever happened." James opened his eyes. His heart gave one hard thump. He didn't rush down. Instead, he sat up, stepped quietly to the door and cracked it open just a few inches, just enough to hear better. Emily's reply was barely a whisper, so faint it could only be heard in complete silence. "I'm sorry, I already cleaned it." "Shut up. Cleaned what? You call this cleaning when there's still a puddle like this?" Diane's voice was cold, hard as stone. "If your grandmother sees this, you'll be sorry. Go get a rag, on your knees, clean it." No sound of footsteps running, just the soft click of a cabinet opening, then the quiet rustle of a towel being pulled out. Less than a minute later, another voice joined in. "Ricky, hey, the monster under the bed's hungry. If anyone disobeys, it'll drag you down and bite your legs off. Got that, kid?" Emily's voice caught, then dropped to a whisper. "Please don't." "What? I was just kidding," Ricky scoffed, his tone sharp, eyes showing not a trace of remorse. "You're really scared? I figured you'd be used to it by now." James had gotten out of bed before the first word was even spoken. He descended the stairs without a sound, one hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly his knuckles went white. As he stopped in front of Emily's door, the last sound that echoed was the thud of something hard plastic or a broom handle falling and hitting the floor. "Dad's home," he said, not loud but clear and sharp like a command. Silence dropped like a heavy blanket. Ricky shot to his feet, hurried toward the door, stammering, "Oh, you're up? I was just watching the girl for Diane. She spilled some water, so I told her to clean it up. I was just messing around. Didn't think she'd freeze up like that." James blocked the doorway, unmoving. He looked at Ricky for exactly 2 seconds, then stepped past him without a word and walked straight into the room. Emily was huddled in the corner, a filthy, soaking rag in her hands. She was still in her old pajamas, hair messy, eyes downcast. A thin film of soapy water glistened on the floor, with dried suds crusted along the grout lines. James knelt down and gently took her hand. The skin was red, not cut, but rough in patches marks, not from heat, but from long, repeated scrubbing under too much pressure. Diane stepped in, eyes tight but smiling anyway. "What's going on? I didn't know Ricky was up here. I was in the kitchen. He must have seen her spill the water and came in to tease her. You know how Ricky is, always running his mouth. The girl's just sensitive, that's all." James didn't answer right away. He carefully pulled the rag from Emily's hand, as though afraid he might hurt her more. She didn't react. Her gaze stayed low. No flinch, no retreat, nothing. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded. It was a slow, mechanical nod, more like something memorized than something felt. James clenched his fists in his lap, the tendons in his hands tightening. He stood up, eyes locked on Diane. "Get out, both of you." Diane hesitated for a beat, as if calculating her reaction. In the end, she just shrugged. "Okay, but you should remember, he's always been prone to overreacting. I'm not saying she didn't feel anything, but sometimes she imagines things. That's what the therapist said, remember?" James looked at her for a few more seconds. Diane's face showed no fear, and her eyes held that annoyingly sincere look. For a moment, he wasn't sure anymore. Was he overthinking all of this? Were the things he noticed just the result of stress after being gone so long? Or did Diane truly believe what she was saying? Ricky rolled his shoulders and gave a mocking grin. "Don't worry about it. Kids these days, every one of them's a scaredy cat." James didn't respond. He just waited for the two of them to leave the room, then quietly closed the door behind them. He sat down, not right next to Emily, but at an angle across from her, leaving just enough space so she wouldn't feel cornered. In the silence, his eyes wandered around the room. It was small, painted a soft pink, once Emily's little world, but now the walls were bare. No pictures, no drawings like before. At the foot of the bed, her old stuffed animal lay crooked. He bent down and picked it up. The belly had a small tear with a few square-folded pieces of paper tucked inside. James unfolded one. The first was a rough crayon drawing of a house with 3 people, a man, a child, and a faceless woman. The second was scrawled in pencil, shaky and uneven. "Don't tell." James didn't say a word. He slipped the papers into his shirt pocket. When he turned back, Emily was still in the same spot, hadn't moved an inch. He sat beside her, not touching. "If there's anywhere you want to go, just tell me. Anywhere at all." Emily turned her head slowly, her eyes no longer carrying the light a 5-year-old should have. She didn't answer. But for the first time she shifted, just a little closer to him. Only a few inches. Just enough for James to know that somewhere in the shadows of her mind, there was still a way out. James left the house before the sun had managed to pierce through the morning mist. He told Diane he had something to take care of. No explanation, no details. She nodded, almost looking relieved. Emily was still asleep, or at least lay motionless beneath the thick blanket. His first stop was Mrs. Charlotte's house, the elderly neighbor who lived just beyond the back wall. She opened the door after peeking through the curtain, looking surprised to see James standing in the yard. "Oh, James, it's been a while." "I've got a few questions and I hope you'll be honest," he said directly. Mrs. Charlotte invited him into the sitting room and poured some tea, though her hand trembled slightly. When James asked about Emily, she hesitated. "Every night I hear crying, soft, more like a whimper. Sometimes it sounds like someone calling for their mother. But I figured, maybe she was sleepwalking. Kids have bad dreams, don't they? Have you ever heard Diane raise her voice?" "Yes, but not all the time. She's got a temper, sure, but she's all smiles in public. You'd never guess." She stopped, setting her hand on the teacup. "I used to suspect something, James, but I was afraid. Mrs. Susan, she's the one who's active in the community, knows the former sheriff. I'm just a retired old woman. What could I do?" James thanked her and stood to leave. Mrs. Charlotte held his hand and said softly, "If you need someone to speak up, I'm not sure I can swear to anything, but I won't stay silent anymore." His last stop was the private clinic where Emily had been seen a few times over the past year. Dr. Fields was reviewing files when James arrived. He welcomed him in with a polite expression, carefully avoiding eye contact. James got straight to the point. "Doctor, have you ever seen anything unusual on Emily?" Fields cleared his throat, turned to the computer screen, and pulled up the records. "She's been noted as rather sensitive, a few mild sore throats, one case of skin irritation, but nothing serious. No diagnosis that would suggest abuse." "Nothing," James said, his voice lowering. "Or nothing you dared write down?" Fields looked up, met his eyes. "James, I'll be honest. Diane is very much in control. Every time she brought the girl in, she described the symptoms before I could ask. Spoke for Emily. She came across as the ideal mother confidant, informed. I don't have the authority to interrogate a parent." James clenched his fist, then let it go. His voice was quieter now. "You're a doctor. You do have the right to ask questions." Fields didn't respond. That afternoon, James returned home. He pulled into the driveway and sat behind the wheel, unmoving. His mind tangled with too many threads. Bethany's words, Charlotte's evasive glances, Dr. Fields's careful silence. Everyone knew, each and every one of them. But no one did a thing. He unlocked his phone, meaning to go over his notes again, when he noticed an unread email. The sender was anonymous. Just a line that read, "For the real father." The message was brief. "If you're truly his father, ask Emily about the corner of the closet where she hides every night." James read it 3 times. No signature, no attachment, but every word felt like a blade driven straight into his heart. He turned off the phone, stepped out of the car, and headed straight to Emily's room. She was coloring and didn't look up when he came in. "Emily," he said gently, sitting down beside the bed. "Daddy wants to ask you something. The corner of your closet, is there something special about it?" Emily looked up. Her eyes went wide, the pupils quivering just a little. She didn't speak, but for the first time that small face showed a flicker of panic. 12:30 that morning, all the neighbors' lights were out. Mrs. Susan had locked up early. Ricky had gone to his room at 9, taking his game console and headphones with him. Diane said she'd stay up to watch TV, but the living room lights had been off since 11. James had driven out right at midnight, making sure everyone in the house believed he had something urgent to take care of. He circled the neighborhood, then cut his headlights, eased back onto the street, and parked at the far end of the alley, locking the car manually. Under the faint glow of the street lamp, he pulled a baseball cap low over his forehead, zipped his jacket up to the neck, and made his way quietly around to the back of the house. He climbed over the wooden fence, the one he'd fixed himself just last year. The back door was locked, but the ground floor window to the storage room still had a way in. He knew exactly how to unlatch it from the outside. Just a small blade and a gentle twist, and the window swung open. James slipped inside without a sound, his feet touching the floor as lightly as breath. The house was pitch dark. He didn't turn on any lights, relying on memory to guide him upstairs. Every stair was familiar. He knew which ones creaked and which didn't. 10 steps, then a left turn. Emily's room was on the right. The door left slightly ajar. James stopped and listened. No crying, no voices, just one sound, quiet and strained, like someone trying to stifle a breath, a faint whimper from inside. He pushed the door open. Still no light, only the soft glow from the hallway stretched across part of the wooden floor. Emily wasn't on the bed. James stepped in, then paused at a soft noise from under the desker. Subtle rustle, like fabric brushing against wood. He moved toward it, bent down. Emily was sitting in there, her back against the wall, arms wrapped around a worn-out stuffed animal. Her head hung low. The toy bear's belly had been slit open, the seam still unstitched. Her eyes were wide, catching the dim light but dry. James turned fully toward her, sitting close, his hand resting gently on her back. He kept his voice slow and steady, every word clear. No, never. No matter what happens, I'll never be mad at you. I'm right here. Emily leaned in, pressing her head against his shoulder. She didn't cry, but she trembled slightly. Her small hands clutched his coat as if she feared he'd disappear if she let go. James stayed like that for a long time. His heartbeat slowed, but inside his chest, the storm hadn't passed. He knew, this moment when Emily leaned in to be close to him, when she chose to speak instead of staying silent, was a sign. The final door had opened. He sat there beside her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders. With the other, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He switched on the recording function. Not to capture her words, she hadn't said much, but to preserve the silence that was speaking louder than anything else. After he helped Emily back into bed and tucked the blanket around her, he left the room, closed the door gently behind him, and made a call. "I need you," he said as soon as the line connected. "Middle of the night? I can't wait. I have reason to suspect child abuse. I need gear and possibly a surveillance warrant if this goes further." The voice on the other end dropped low. "Been a long time since I've heard you sound this serious, James. This time it's real, Marcus. It's my kid." James stepped out to the backyard, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one. He didn't smoke it, just held it between his fingers while it burned. The smoke drifted in the wind, thin as a strand of memory. The torn photo of Elena was still in his jacket pocket. On the floor inside, 3 adhesive bandages were sealed in a plastic bag for evidence. He knew he couldn't turn back now, not out of anger, but because of his 5-year-old daughter, the one who had learned to sit in a dark closet just to feel a little safer. The next morning, James drove to the old phone repair shop near the bus station where Marcus had arranged to meet. No sign, no security cameras. The metal shutter was rolled halfway up, revealing a dim yellow light inside and the soft hum of an old fan. Marcus was already waiting, sleeves rolled, face as unreadable as when he was deep undercover. "Got something for you," Marcus said, laying 3 small items on the table. A charging plug with a hidden mic, a button-sized camera, and a tiny recording chip embedded inside. the head of a stuffed teddy bear. "This one's for Emily," he said with a dry smile, pointing to the bear. "When she hugs it, it records everything around her. Battery recharges automatically through a body heat sensor." James nodded without asking further. Carefully, he packed each item into a shock-proof pouch, then left through the back door. That afternoon, when Diane brought Emily home from school, James was out front changing the porch light. Ricky sat in the living room, over-ear headphones on, eyes locked to his phone. No one paid attention as James slipped into Emily's room to check on a broken outlet. He plugged the charger into the corner socket, checked the signal on his phone app, then placed the teddy bear neatly beside her pillow. The whole thing took less than 8 minutes. The evening passed with an eerie calm. Diane joked around in the kitchen, making spaghetti, James's old favorite. Ricky dragged his feet doing the dishes, and Emily sat quietly at the dinner table, so well-behaved it felt almost wrong. James didn't say much, but his eyes stayed on the clock, waiting for midnight. 2 a.m. The room was completely dark, lit only by the glow of James's phone screen. The first audio file had just finished downloading. He plugged in his headphones and hit play. The first sound was footsteps, then a soft whimper from Emily. Diane's voice came through, sharp and crystal clear. "Spilled the water again, huh? How many damn times do I have to tell you? Useless, just like the whore who gave birth to you." Then came a smack unclear if it was a dish or something harder. Emily didn't cry, didn't beg, only the sound of her breathing, broken and trembling. Then Ricky's voice came through, mixed with the sound of a door creaking open. "Shh. This is our little secret, remember? Anyone who tells will get dragged away by the monster." Emily didn't answer. A long silence followed. Then came the slow, dry click of the door closing. James pulled off his headphones and shot upright in bed, his heart pounding like a hammer. He turned on the small lamp, plugged in his phone, and opened the monitoring app. The camera had captured Emily's room at night from the corner near her headboard. Not clear enough to make out faces, but enough to mark the timing. He called Marcus. "I need you to hear this. Can't wait." On the other end, he heard coffee being poured. Marcus listened to the first part of the recording. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then his voice came low and firm. "It's enough to start, but not enough to convict. Diane will say he's just disciplining a stepchild. Ricky will laugh it off as teasing a kid. You know how this game is played." James pressed his fingers to his forehead. "So what do I do? Wait until—" "No," Marcus cut in. "You have to be patient and precise. If you move now, they'll disappear and take Emily with them. I've seen it happen before." Silence. James sat down, his hand clenched. "So what's the next step?" "I'll clean up and store the evidence. You act like nothing happened, smile, eat dinner, say thank you, and keep recording." The next day, James had dinner with the whole family. He told an old joke from his army days that made Ricky laugh. Diane played along too, even refilled his wine glass. Emily sat beside him, quiet, but she glanced at her father. Not a look for help, a look of waiting. That night, Emily talked in her sleep. James was reading the paper in his room when he heard her whimpering. He opened the door and stepped in, whispering, "Daddy's here." Emily turned over, still asleep, her voice trembling in a dream. "Mr. Ricky turned off the light, wouldn't let me breathe. I was scared. I didn't dare scream." James clenched his fists. He didn't wake his daughter, but in his mind a decision had just formed, sharp and undeniable, like an internal alarm bell blaring. The next morning, James installed a small camera underneath the dining table. Another one was hidden inside a fountain pen he always carried with him. Every time Ricky stepped into Emily's room, James noted the time. Whenever Diane yelled, he recorded her tone and attitude. And every night he sent the data to Marcus encrypted, stored on 2 separate hard drives, one of which sat inside a bank safe registered under Marcus's name. Emily didn't know. Diane didn't know. Ricky didn't know. James had become a man with 2 faces, quiet father and a silent sentinel. When James sat alone in his car past midnight, listening to the third recording, the one where Emily only breathed softly as Ricky mentioned the monster under the bed. He knew he was reaching his limit, not because he lacked evidence, but because every second he waited was another day Emily had to live with a fear she didn't know how to name. That afternoon, James drove Emily to Grandma Charlotte's house, using the excuse that Daddy's got to take care of something out of state for a few days. Charlotte didn't ask much. She just looked into his eyes, gave a small nod, then gently reached for Emily's hand. The little girl stepped inside without looking back, as if she already understood that something was shifting. As the car pulled away from the gate, James didn't roll down the window. He needed to stay focused. Last night in a recording, Ricky had whispered to Emily, "Grandma will make you stay quiet if you talk." James knew it was time to face the place where it all began. The first person James went to see was Annie, an old buddy from his military days, now working in social services. She agreed to meet him at a cafe near the staff housing complex. "Diane Lambert," James began, handing her a slip of paper with a name and date of birth. "Used to live in Arizona before 2007. Do you have a file on her?" Annie glanced at it, then sat still for a few seconds. "That name rings a bell. Give me 2 hours." 2 hours later, Annie sent James a secure email, an excerpt from a sealed case file, noting a girl named Diane who had been emotionally and physically abused by her biological mother. The file included a diagnosis: severe depression, with signs of borderline personality disorder. She dropped out of school twice, once slashed her wrist at age 15. Biological mother, Susan Lamberthard, been flagged for child welfare violations but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. James read it line by line in his car. His hands started to shake, not from fear, but from something else. Something in his own hatred had just cracked. The next person James sought out was Clarissa, high school classmate of Diane's, now working at a library in the next town over. Clarissa wasn't surprised to see him. She invited him to sit down, then quietly poured a glass of water. "I used to wish someone would come ask me about Diane." Clarissa recalled that back in 11th grade, Diane got pregnant. The father was a college freshman. He disappeared the moment he found out. Diane's mother, Mrs. Susan, forced her to drop out of school and locked her inside the house for nearly 2 months. When Diane was finally taken to the hospital, her mother coerced her into having an abortion, signed the consent forms herself because Diane was still under 18. After that, Diane was never the same. She became distant, cold. No more friends, no more smiles. "I was just a kid too," Clarissa said, her eyes brimming with tears. "There was nothing I could do. But ever since I heard she became a stepmom, I've been worried." James didn't go home. He drove straight to Dr. Fields' office, this time without an appointment. Fields was tidying up some papers. When he saw James, he let out a weary sigh. "I figured this day would come." James set his phone down on the desk. "I want the truth." Fields didn't dodge. He removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "The first time I examined Emily, I had my suspicions. But Diane, she knew I'd been suspended once for a false report in an old case. She told me if I made something up again, she'd sue me for harassment and defamation. I knew one article, just one, and I'd lose my license for good." James clenched his fists, but kept his voice low. "Do you regret it?" "Every single day," Fields replied, "and I'm willing to testify if you need me." James stood outside the house. The sky was overcast, the wind soft. He didn't go in right away. He waited until the living room light switched off, until Ricky stepped into the bathroom, until the house had gone completely still. Then he rang the doorbell. 3 firm presses. Susan answered. The light from inside spilled across her aged but steely face. She didn't look surprised. "You're late." James met her eyes. "We need to talk. About Diane. About Emily." She stepped back without inviting him in. James walked in on his own and closed the door behind him. They sat across from each other in the living room. The only light came from a dim table lamp. Susan sipped her tea, unhurried, unshaken. "You think I am the reason for all this?" James said nothing. "Diane's always been fragile. Ever since she was little. She never learned to be strong. I raised her that way because the world doesn't make room for the weak. By forcing her to have an abortion, by beating her down so hard she ended up hating any other child who reminded her of her own." Susan set the glass down, the sound of it hitting the table sharp and cold, like ice cracked. Tuesday. Overcast sky, a thick blanket of dark clouds covered the horizon like a curtain before a grand performance. James skipped breakfast. He only drank water, waiting until exactly 8:35 a.m., the time he had arranged the night before with Marcus and the Child Protective Services officer. The front door opened like it did every day. Ricky was sprawled out on the sofa, one leg draped over the armrest, a game controller in his hand. Diane was in the kitchen, slicing apples for Emily's breakfast. The little girl sat in a high chair, back stiff as if being punished. 3 knocks, measured, punctual. Diane looked up, a slight frown forming. Ricky groaned, lazily getting up to answer the door. What he saw froze him in place. 2 police officers in full uniform stood beside a woman wearing a vest marked with the Child Protective Services logo. Marcus stood behind them, not in uniform, just wearing his badge on a lanyard. "Good morning," Marcus said calmly. "We have an emergency child welfare check order under Statute 42-6. Everyone in the house is required to cooperate immediately." Diane stepped out of the kitchen, her mouth barely forming words. "What? There must be a mistake." The social worker produced the order, her voice firm. "We've received a report including audio and video evidence of both emotional and physical abuse involving a minor residing at this address." Ricky backed away. "I don't know anything. I'm just staying here for a bit." One of the officers stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Ricky bolted, tried to make it to the back door, but he didn't get far. He was taken down before he could reach it. Diane screamed, "You're insane. That's my child. This is all lies, all made up." James stood outside, silent. He didn't interfere, but his eyes never left Emily clutching a worn-out teddy bear, her hands trembling. The social worker approached her gently. "Emily, sweetheart, you're coming with me. Everything's going to be okay now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Emily looked up at James. For the first time, her eyes seemed to truly connect with something real. James stepped forward, giving a small nod. He knelt down, voice low and steady. "You're safe now, I promise." Emily remained silent, but her small hand clutched his shirt tightly. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. It was just a gentle, leaner, small gesture. But the first time she'd leaned on him since he came back. Marcus turned away. The social worker raised a hand to wipe the corner of her eye. None of the remaining officers said another word. Diane was held in the house for a preliminary interview. James didn't go in. But once everyone had left, he was allowed into the living room where she sat, hands trembling, though her eyes stayed dry. "Are you doing this because you hate me?" Diane asked, her voice hoarse. James didn't answer right away. He sat across from her, arms folded. Then calmly, slowly, he said, "No, I did it for Emily, but I don't hate you." Diane looked at him, her gaze empty. "I didn't mean to. I just didn't know how. I didn't know how to be a mother." James gave a small nod, then he stood up, getting ready to leave. Just before stepping through the door, he paused, looked straight at her, not with anger, not with pity, just the eyes of someone who once believed. "I know, Diane, I know you were hurt. I know you were a child no one protected, but that's not a reason to make another child live through the same thing." Diane said nothing. James lowered his head, exhaling slowly. "But I still hope you find a way to save yourself, if there's still a chance." As the car pulled away from the alley, the first light of dawn began to rise on the horizon. Emily had fallen asleep on James's shoulder, still clutching her teddy bear. Her forehead rested against his neck, her breathing steady and light. No more flinching, no more fear. Marcus sat in the front seat, watching the rear-view mirror. "You can rest now, James." James didn't respond. His arms were wrapped around Emily, his eyes gazing quietly out the window. No one said anything else. But one thing was clear. Today, the silence had been broken not with shouting, but with the right act at the right time. A child who couldn't find words for her pain, a father who thought he could never forgive, and a woman who never learned how to love, had finally reached each other through a moment that didn't need words. The county court session took place in a small courtroom, not too crowded. Outside, the weather was cold, a steady drizzle falling, but inside every gaze was fixed on three people: Diane, Ricky, and Susan. Diane sat still, her hair neatly tied back. Her hands weren't cuffed, but they trembled. Ricky fidgeted constantly, clearly unaccustomed to the courtroom's silence. Suzanne's woman, who once controlled every conversation, now sat quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. James was present, seated in the second row just behind the prosecutor. Emily wasn't with him. She had stayed home with Grandma Charlotte, as her therapist had recommended. In the closing statement, the prosecutor read excerpts from audio recordings, injury photographs, and Emily's treatment journal. The evidence was presented clearly, coherently, with no need to raise his voice. "This isn't a case about sudden evil," he said, "but about prolonged silence, about a chain of neglect, abuse, and concealment, where the only victim was a child who didn't have the words to speak for herself." The judge looked directly at Diane, his voice calm. "Diane Lambert, as the legal guardian, you are hereby sentenced to 4 years in prison, without the possibility of suspension, for the substantiated abuse of a minor." Then he turned to Ricky. Ricky Morgan, you are convicted of emotional harassment of a child involving threats and intimidation. You are sentenced to 18 months in prison with supervised probation." And finally, Susan, the one few had expected to be held accountable, but whose role could not be overlooked. "Susan Lambert, while you did not commit physical acts of violence, the court finds you guilty of incitement and willful enabling of domestic abuse. You are sentenced to 2 years probation and prohibited from contact with your granddaughter and any other minors." Tears slid down Diane's cheeks. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. Her shoulders just sagged, as if, at last, she could no longer hold herself up. A few days after the hearing, Emily returned to therapy with James. Lorraine, the silver-haired psychologist with a voice as soft as tissue paper, stepped out from the back room and gave them a quiet nod. No words were needed. She opened the door and James went in with her. "I want to draw today," Emily said softly. Her voice was still slow, but no longer laced with fear. James sat in the corner of the room, not too close, not too far. He watched, hands resting in his lap, careful not to do anything that might break the fragile quiet forming between them. Emily picked up a brown crayon, then green, then a pale orange. A picture began to take shape on the paper, a house with a red-tiled roof, a small chimney, letting out a thin trail of smoke. The windows had purple curtains and outside was a garden with 2 apple trees. A swing was drawn in dotted lines, but clear enough. Beneath the trees, 2 figures were sitting, one tall with dark hair, the other small, leaning on the taller one's shoulder. Lorraine didn't rush in. She waited until Emily set the crayon down, then gently asked, "Who are they, sweetheart?" Emily tilted her head. Then she turned and looked at James. Her face lit up, just a flicker of light in her eyes. "It's home. It's me and Daddy." James swallowed hard, saying nothing. He smiled quietly. One hand rested on his knee, the other clenched in his lap. The days that followed passed gently, as if even the air in the house had learned to move more softly. James started waking up earlier. He warmed the milk to the exact temperature the doctor recommended. Practiced making toast just crisp enough, without burning the edges. He had been a Special Forces soldier, but never cooked for anyone, never learned how to read toothpaste labels for a 6-year-old. In the afternoons, he drove Emily to school in the pickup truck. In the evenings, they played word games with little wooden tiles. Sometimes they just colored together in silence. James didn't ask, "Do you remember anything?" He didn't push, "You have to forgive." He was simply there, present, every day. One rainy night, after finishing The Little Girl and the Silent Forester book Emily had picked out from the school library, James closed the cover and started to rise. Emily tugged at his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy?" He turned back, waiting. "You're staying, right?" James didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, sat down by the bed, and laid his hand on the blanket, covering hers. "I'm not going anywhere. Even if you're sad or angry or quiet, I'm staying." Emily nodded, then pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. For the first time, she did it herself, without waiting for an adult to help. A tiny smile flickered across her lips, just enough for James to catch it like the surface of a glass of water trembling when someone brushes past. The next morning, James was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen when Emily came running in, a sheet of drawing paper in her hand. She didn't say anything. She climbed up on a chair, grabbed some tape, and stuck the paper onto the refrigerator. James wiped his hands and walked over. The drawing showed 2 people standing in the rain, James, in a coat, Emily holding an umbrella. At their feet was a puddle, and slanted lines all around them suggested the wind. Up in the left-hand corner, scrawled in uneven letters, was one word: home. The H was written backward, but the strokes were bold and clear. James stood still. No one had taught Emily to write that word. No one had told her what this house was supposed to be, but she'd written it. No explanation needed. No caption. The answer was right there, in the shaky lines of the drawing, between the 2 figures standing in the rain, still holding each other's hand. There was no applause, no speech. Just a single sheet of paper taped to the fridge door, with 2 small pieces of tapey like a sign that both of them quietly understood. From now on, this is home. Autumn. Red leaves drifted steadily onto the suburban road. The breeze was light, no rain, but the overcast sky made everything seem to move a little slower. James stepped out of headquarters, holding a brown envelope. No recipient name, just 2 handwritten words, slanted slightly. Emily, Jane. The letter had come from the North County Psychological Recovery Center, verified by stamp Diane Lambert. Written a week ago, sent to James's temporary address, passed along by a caseworker. James had read it, once, then folded it. He didn't tear it up, didn't throw it away. He placed it in the drawer beside his bed. Each night he opened it, not to read again, but just to make sure it was still there. The letter was 3 pages long. The handwriting was still firm, though it shook in places. "If there's another life, all I hope is that you'll never call anyone mother except your birth mother. But if you could call me that once, just once, I'd walk the rest of this road trying to earn it." Diane didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't make excuses. She only wrote about her days in the facility. The therapy group, the sleepless nights when she saw the little girl in her dreams, standing in the corner of the room, holding that old teddy bear, watching in silence. James didn't know what to do with the letter. Emily had never asked about Diane, never once mentioned her. Dr. Lorraine had said, "There's no rush. A child doesn't need the whole truth all at once, but one day she'll need it told in a voice that's honest, not bitter." James remembered that Saturday morning. James was fixing the car in the garage. The air was chilly. A low voice on the radio gave the traffic report. Emily was inside, drawing on her tablet. Lately, she'd been drawing a lot of houses with doors, trees, windows. No more dark rooms, no more corners. Close to noon, the front gate buzzer rang. James stepped out. Emily was already there, hands on her hips, ponytail slightly off to one side, cheeks pink from the cold. The gate swung open and she ran toward him, arms flung wide. "You're 5 minutes late," she said, pretending to scold. James let out a soft laugh. I hit a red light. Emily took his hand, said nothing else. They walked back into the house together. Behind them, the gate eased shut with a familiar creak, a sound that used to feel cold, but didn't anymore. In the evening, Emily took her new drawing and taped it to the wall next to the refrigerator. The picture showed a house with the lights on. The door was open. Out in the yard stood two figures, one big, one small. There was an apple tree with fruit, beside it a stone bench. On the table, a letter drawn in pale grey with gentle strokes. James looked at it, but didn't ask. Emily didn't explain either. But as James turned back to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, she spoke quietly behind him. I think if someone accidentally went the wrong way for a while, but wanted to come back, then the door should be open. James set the glass down. He stood still for a moment. You're right, he said, but not every door needs to open right away. Some need time to be knocked on the right way. Emily nodded. Then she turned and ran off to her room. Her small footsteps tapped evenly on the wooden floor. At the end of the hallway, she stopped. Dad? Yeah? Please don't lock the door, okay? Never, James said. The door's always open. James and Emily's story isn't just a search for justice. It's a journey to find trust again, the most fragile yet powerful thing inside each of us. No one is born knowing how to be a father or a mother, but when standing in front of a small heart that needs protecting, what matters isn't how perfect we are, it's whether we're brave enough to stay even knowing it might hurt. What do you think of this ending? If it were you, would you have given Emily that letter? Do you believe that someone who's caused pain can be redeemed? And hey, how have you been lately? Is there something that's making you stay even though you're tired? If you're going through quiet days right now, I hope you know you're not alone. Someone out there is still waiting for you to open your own door again. Feel free to share your thoughts below. I always read them, and I'm always listening.